I'm Dr. Ian Clary, and I'm here with Dr. Brad Littlejohn, and we're having a discussion on the nature of COVID lockdowns and Christians and churches' responses to civil magistrates, whether in our respective countries, states, or provinces, and what rights they have and what obligations and duties we have to obey them. So we're going to kind of continue on with the discussion by looking now at the very specific question of what is the nature of our obligation. So by our, I'm thinking here in terms of Christians and churches. What are our obligations to obey the civil magistrate?
Sure. So, of course, the starting point here is Paul's admonition in Romans 13:1 to be subject to the governing authorities. And Paul says they've been established by God to do good, to judge wrongdoers. And Christians throughout the ages have understood that our obligation to obey God is primary, of course, but that we should be grateful to God for establishing civil authorities as having real authority under him that can bind us to obedience as Christians. Now, if we think about why do we need civil authority? I think it can be helpful to start there. And I think we could answer that question in at least three different ways. So first, civil authority solves a motivation problem. And this as a result of sin, at least. If we'd never sinned, then we would always desire to do the right thing. And so we wouldn't need the fear of punishment to do the right thing. But as fallen beings, we quite often, sometimes we know what we should do, but we don't want to do it. And we need to be cajoled or threatened in various ways or have the hope of reward held out to us. And part of that comes simply from our social norms surrounding us. That the disapproval of other people can often hold us back from evil. But when push comes to shove, sometimes the disapproval of other people isn't enough, and you need to put some teeth on it, right? And that's what the civil magistrate is for.
Hence the sword.
Hence the power, the sword. And that's what I think Christians often emphasize today. He does not wield the sword in vain, right? So, that's not all there is to it. Most of the Christian tradition has taught that even without the fall, there would have been some need for civil government, because civil government doesn't just solve a motivation problem, it solves a coordination problem. The fact that we are, even if we're not fallen, we're fallible creatures. We are, we're fallible because we're finite. We are capable of having certainly limited knowledge, and indeed, part of having limited knowledge is having incorrect knowledge.
Right.
At the very least, partial knowledge. So we could want to do the right thing, but we don't always know fully what the right thing is. Certainly, if we're talking about a large number of people trying to work together, living together, supplying their needs together, caring for each other, trying not to infect one another, trying to care for one another when sick, whatever. These things require coordination, and that's not going to happen spontaneously. You have to, this is whenever you form a club or society, one of the first things you do, if you have the first meeting, you elect president, you elect the treasurer, et cetera, right? So we recognize the need for some structure of established leadership to coordinate our activities toward a common good. And related closely to that, I already alluded to it, I framed the coordination problem in terms of limited knowledge. But I want to emphasize the knowledge side of things, because many people would say, okay, yeah, sure, I understand we need the civil government to motivate us not to do evil. I understand they need to coordinate our activities in certain ways. And so, sure, we will we'll obey the civil magistrate when they are doing their job of repressing evil and rewarding good and coordinating our activities toward the common good. But we shouldn't obey them when they're not doing that, which is totally fine in principle. But the problem is, says who? I mean, perhaps they are knowingly departing from their task, but quite possibly the person in charge is trying to do their task and they're convinced they are doing it. And you, lowly citizen, are convinced they're not doing it. And there's a knowledge problem here in that how do we know who's right? How do we know what the right course of action is, particularly in a very complex, interconnected modern society, particularly when facing a threat that's maybe familiar enough to our ancestors, but unfamiliar to us now, and certainly our ways of combating it are new in terms of a global pandemic. There's a problem of limited knowledge and the problem of different views as to what should be done. And the fact of the matter is that if anything is going to be done, somebody has to make a final judgment. Someone's got to be able to, the buck has to stop somewhere. Someone has to be in charge of making a decision. Everybody else has to go along with that decision. You can't be a sort of suggestion. Hey, here's my idea, and everybody who agrees with me, do my thing, and everybody who doesn't agree with it, don't, right? When you reach that point, that's where society falls apart, right? So for society to hold together requires deference to an established authority in resolving complex questions where we all have limited knowledge.
So living as we do in a society where social media, we're being bombarded with information, conflicting information all the time, whether it's on the pandemic or anything else. And so there has to be a certain degree, what you're saying, a certain degree of humility when it comes to our authorities and the work that they're trying to do, instead of a fundamental assumption that everything that they're doing is wrong. Everything that they're doing is malevolent, and they're trying to harm us in some way. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality that we're living through is that civil society and effective civil government, we talk about the sword, and we often think, it relies on the power of coercion, but that's not really, that's true only in a limited sense. I mean, effective government relies on coercion as a last resort. If it has to rely on coercion as a first resort, it's not going to last very long, right? What it relies on generally is public trust. Yeah. And public trust has to be, the vast majority of people obey because either A, at best, they trust that the decisions being taken are the right decisions, or B, they're not sure if they're the right decisions, but they understand that they might be the right decisions, and so they're going to defer. And then C is, I'm convinced these are wrong, and I'm only obeying because I'm afraid of being arrested or something. So you can't have a society function very long where a majority of people are in category C. Right. And part of the problem, as you note, is it's very hard to keep a majority of people in category A these days. And part of that lies at the doorstep of our authorities, who have often squandered their moral authority, their intellectual authority, by sort of naked hypocrisy, political favoritism, getting on board with kind of pet causes, and in various ways that have really frittered away their authority. But part of it also is the fact that, as you say, we are inundated with so many authority claims. We are inundated with so many different pieces of information that every single thing seems to be up for grabs. And so even the best and most effective civil magistrates can find themselves facing a massive trust deficit. And I think that's just a huge reality of the world we're living in right now. And I guess it's not an easy problem to solve, but one thing I do want to say on this is that the church needs to understand that this is a serious problem, and that the church has to be part of the solution to this problem, because a world in which there's a massive deficit of trust, in which there's a lack of confidence in objective truth, in which everything becomes subjective, in which everybody makes up their own mind about things, that is a world in which the church and the historic Christian faith is in every bit as much danger as civil society. And I think that many Christians have taken kind of a short-sighted view, and they think in terms of a rivalry of church and state, which is understandable given the extent to which the secular society has in certain ways made war on the church in the West. And so we think of it in terms of rivalry. And so we think anything that can kind of bring the state down a bit and reduce their authority and hurt their credibility, that's going to help us. And we don't realize that everything we're doing to chip away at the authority of civil government is in many ways also chipping away at the authority of the church. So however we navigate these complicated questions surrounding COVID, we need to understand that the right solution is going to be one in which helps people have confidence again in navigating uncertainty and in the role of human authority in navigating uncertainty.
So, per something you said a moment ago, that government, civil government, is not as a result of the fall, but it would be something that would be prelapsarian or pre-fall. So, because of that, then government really, and order in a society, and leaders and hierarchies and whatever else, are actually good. And I think then what you're saying also is that there's a tendency, and I'm Canadian, so I come out of a context where we're not always super suspicious of our governments. But now that I'm living down here for the last couple of years in Colorado, it seems like it's just baked into a more kind of American Christian ethos that the government's out to get you. Like, they're bad inherently. I haven't read it enough, but my suspicion is some of those people would argue, well, the only reason there is government is because of the fall. So if we should then see it as a good, and then put a certain amount of like trust in that inherent goodness, would you say?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think it's a difficult thing for many people to hear right now, where people feel like that trust has been eroded so much, and in many ways, they're being asked to trust something that doesn't seem trustworthy. But I do think the point to make there is, if something is established by God, and if it is established by God as a good, and it's important always for us to sort of pause and think, what's the context in which Paul is writing Romans 13, right? I mean, it's not, he's writing under the Emperor Nero. It's not as if Paul and the apostles, or John Calvin and Martin Luther, that they were unaware of, wicked tyrannical governments. I would say, really, the government we live under there are important differences, but in most respects, much better and more trustworthy than what they had to grapple with. Yeah. So it's important to recognize that even a very corrupted government is still a God-given good. And as such, we have an obligation, as we do. I mean, this is what the Westminster Confession calls, how do we think about our obligations to superiors? And one of the things it says is basically you have an obligation to try to cover over their faults, as Shem and Japheth cover over the nakedness of their father Noah, instead of trying to expose their faults. So I think that does have to be our demeanor as Christians. Now, that doesn't deprive us of obligations to oppose policies that we think are genuinely harmful. Love of neighbor can require us to resist. But that resistance has to be done from a position of gratitude for God-given authority.
Yeah, that's a good thought to end on. So in the next section here, we're going to start talking about the virus itself. But it's good to have these thoughts in mind, just in terms of, broadly speaking, what is the Christian's obligation? I think first and foremost, it's kind of a mindset obligation. It's to say, yeah, you know what? God actually instituted government and order in a civil society pre-fall. That's something that's carried with us. It's now flawed because of the nature of the fall. But arguably then it's something that'll persist into the eschaton. And so we have government with us, whether we like it or not, and we should see it as an inherent good. Yet in its fallen state, there's going to be problems, and we're going to have certain degree of, but the default really should be, yes, we actually should trust that that God is behind the government that we have, and he's doing good things through them, flawed or not. All right, well, we'll continue on speaking about the virus momentarily.